Ho, ho, ho. Got on my Santa Claus glasses today. I'm letting this grow out. Well, I don't have a choice. Can't go get it cut. Yeah. Anyway, welcome, American Republic. Listen, be thankful because all the other classes are having tests today. Yours will be on Monday, but it will be open book test, so you should do well. Every answer will be in the book. So take your time with it when you get it on Monday. Tomorrow, on Friday, we're going to have our Zoom class where we get together for just a little bit. So keep that in mind. Be ready for that. And we're just rolling right along. And then some of y'all already know this, but a week from Friday, a week from tomorrow, we're off for Good Friday. So there you go. Um, anyway, we're looking at page, it starts on page 313, but the bulk of it will start on page 314. There's just like a paragraph on 313. This video will not be too long, and your assignment, I'll tell you about it in just a moment. But we are looking at the recovery of the South or in the South. And a couple of things happen. First of all, if you've got a bunch of people, freedmen, men and women, usually black, were freed slaves, and they had had a place to live. They had a house, they had property, they had a job. Now, granted, they weren't paid, but now they're free. What do you do? And one of the things that they wanted was for people in Washington, D.C. to confiscate all of the land of these big plantation owners. And if they did that, then they could give every freed man a mule and 40 acres and a mule. And some people like that idea, but the politicians never did it. So here's what happened: they needed a job and they needed a place to live. So a lot of them ended up as hired hands on farms, and they were called sharecroppers. Now, sharecroppers were not just black, there were blacks, there were whites, both. And here's the way it worked: you could live in this house on this property, you could farm a certain amount of acreage, and all you had to do to pay for your rent and to pay for renting the land is give the landowner a certain amount of crop. Share the crop, share cropping. And it sounds good on the surface, depending on what the share is, but the problem is, um, on this plantation, just like plantations were, except now they weren't called plantations, they were called farms, they would have all the stuff you would go to, and a lot of them own their own stores. And so they're getting their money back through that. And at the beginning of the year, after they had sold their crops, the sharecropper, you're living there, let's say you got to keep a certain percentage of the crop. Well, by the time you bought all that you needed to get you through the winter, here comes springtime, it's time for planting, and you're out of money. You've used every bit of it just to survive the winter. And you're like, well, I don't have any seeds to plant. Well, here comes the property owner, and they say, well, I tell you what, I'll sell you these seeds, and here's your price, and I'll put it on credit for you. So they're working out of the hole from the beginning every year. And your book uses the statistic that I believe it was two out of every 15 years, was it? You made a profit. It was something like that. It was astronomical that you never made a profit. So that was one of the things. And people, it was basically slavery, but it was called sharecropping. But it did provide them at least jobs. 2 years out of 25 years, I was correct. I found it as I was looking. Also, one thing that happened in the South, the Industrial Revolution came to the South. That's where you see some of these cities start to pop up and start to grow. Birmingham becomes, an industrial city, things of that nature. But textile mills, um, steel, railroad, all of those start to expand in the South because before it's been agricultural. Now we see the Industrial Revolution finally reach the South. Now, the difference is Southerners did not have a lot of money to invest in business. So a lot of the businesses, a lot of the plants, a lot of the factories were owned by Northerners, but they would hire Southerners. Now, working in these factories in a lot of ways was like sharecropping. And I'll tell you why. They would build houses, mill row houses. They all looked alike, all small little houses. And they would also build churches and stores and a doctor's office and all of this stuff. You saw it in all kinds of businesses, even the coal industry over in Kentucky and West Virginia. They would do this. And they build a mill town. And what would happen is you would work in this store or work in this factory. And also, by the way, if you wanted to work there, if you were an adult, usually they made it mandatory that all of your family worked there. So your wife and your kids would have to work there as well. But they would work in this factory, and then when they went to buy some flour, or they went to buy some material for a dress, or when they went to buy medicine, or when they went to the doctor's office, where's that revenue going to? It's going right back to the factory owner. So it was a good system for them, and it kept a lot of people in a lot of poverty. But, I mean, they were jobs, and you provided a livelihood for your family. Now, one thing that happened during this Industrial Revolution in the South is the South economy started to boom. It wasn't just agricultural, it wasn't just cotton. And another thing that happened is people moved from the countries to the cities. And again, that's when these cities start to grow up. Another event that your book talks about is the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. And this was a group that basically targeted successful black people. And it targeted black voters. And it targeted black politicians. And it targeted whites who aided blacks to become successful. There were even examples of if a freedman was dressed nicely, had on a suit and tie, the Ku Klux Klan might attack them. It also it would persecute and sometimes kill whites who would testify against members of the Ku Klux Klan. And the thing about the Klan that you've got to understand, why was it so powerful? Because it had powerful white people involved in it. And they would wear, as you see the cartoon depiction on page 315, they would wear hoods. They would wear robes. And so you could have the mayor of a town, you could have the sheriff of a town, you could have the police chief of a town, you could have whatever, some high-ranking official, the judge, and they could dress in a hood, they could dress in a gown, and no one knew who they were. But these people were involved with it, and the Klan became a powerful organization. Your book also points out the statistics show that around 1,300 freedmen were lynched. Now, lynch is where you put a rope in a tree and you hang a person without a trial, without a jury. You just hang them because you think they ought to be hanged. One of the big time members, and it's been debated as to whether he founded it or not, Nathan Bedford Forrest. You'll probably remember his name from the Civil War. He was one of the bigwigs in the KKK. And one of the things the Klan did, because blacks were voting Republican, and they were running for office and obtaining office as Republicans. One thing that the KKK did is they tried to stamp out the Republican Party in the South. They were very successful in that. In fact, it's going to be about 100 years from the Klan's first inception before Republicans start to have any kind of foothold in the South again. It would be about 120 years or so before the Republican Party really took off. So, as you notice, the Klan were Democrats, in essence. The thing that stopped the original Ku Klux Klan, the original one, was the Force Act of 1870. And as I mentioned, Klansmen were trying to stop voting of blacks. And so the Force Act of 1870 said that federal troops could come and be at polling places and therefore make it safe for blacks to vote. And they could enforce this with force. So that was the Force Act of 1870, and they would bring federal troops to polling places. So the Klan kind of went underground. It would reform in 1915 and kind of have several more years that it would last, but it would never be as influential as it was during this time. And you've got to imagine how terrified you would be if you were a black American that saw someone show up in your yard at night with a hood and a gown on. I mean, it's just terrible, terrible stuff. Lastly, reforms in the South. And one thing that happened, this mentality, Democrats have been known for this for years: tax and spend. Tax and spend. In the South, where they didn't have public education, they started taxing where they could provide public education, where they could provide prison systems, and develop care for people with mental and physical disabilities. They started taxing people in order to spend money on infrastructure and on schools and on those type of things. And this whole idea, well, if we need it, let's just tax the people more and we'll spend it. And the Democrat Party, for, well, even today it's even worse than ever, has followed that suit. But it really started in the South during this period. Finally, your book talks about Reconstruction evaluated. It's one of those things, people are going to debate it. Some people say it went too far. Some people say it didn't go far enough. One thing people will say is that there was still an animosity toward freedmen or blacks, that they didn't go far enough with enforcing civil rights laws. And your book mentions a couple of laws. I want you to take note of that as you're reading that were passed during the Reconstruction period and just beyond. So it's one of those things you could debate it, just like was Lincoln a good president or not. We could debate that for days and weeks. You could do the same thing with Reconstruction. How would you have done it different? Did it work? Those type of things. So the last statement I want to read from your book: but the Christian must be grateful that Congress tried to fulfill the primary biblical purpose of government, ensuring justice. And that's, in the end, what it is all about, ensuring justice. Out of this movement as well, Reconstruction, we talked about a bunch about states' rights and the Civil War, that was the overwhelming cause, South Carolina especially, states' rights. After Reconstruction, states have very, very, very little rights. This is the point that the federal government becomes this big centralized national government, and states have very little rights. So you will see that in the rest of history of our country, that the federal government is it on a stick, and the states governments, they're just there. So that's when all of that really started to happen. Okay, page 316, section quiz, number 1, 2, 3, and 4. You'll see it right there, page 316. If you will do that, turn it in. Tomorrow we Zoom together. Hope you have a great, great rest of your day, and I'm looking forward to seeing your faces tomorrow. Please try to be there. Hopefully you wrote down the time. I will put a reminder with your class tomorrow about what time, and I'll give you the codes and all of that stuff. Y'all have a great, great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.